It was a vast, unforgiving emptiness that swallowed them whole, an endless blue desert beneath which the secrets of their final hours lay entombed. Years later, investigators would stare at the black and white photograph of the cruise ship, its brightly lit decks a stark and cruel contrast to the grim reality of the deep, and ask themselves the same agonizing question. How could two people simply vanish from a vessel the size of a floating city? The year was 2000, and the disappearance of George Allen Smith and his wife Jennifer, a young, vibrant couple from New York, was not the first maritime mystery, but it would become one of the most perplexing and emotionally charged cases in the modern age of cruising. They boarded the Sea Voyager in July, anticipating a dream honeymoon cruise through the Mediterranean. A romantic escape meant to be the first chapter of their life together. Instead, it became the last. Their fellow passengers would later recall the couple as happy, perhaps too happy, enjoying the endless flow of champagne and the intoxicating freedom of the open sea. This initial picture of marital bliss was the first layer of the mystery, a shimmering facade that concealed a growing, darker tension that only the cold, impersonal log entries of the ship would eventually betray. The honeymoon was, for all intents and purposes, uneventful until the final fateful night. Jennifer's mother, waiting anxiously for her daughter's return, felt a creeping dread that no amount of rationalization could fully dispel. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from the cruise line was deafening, punctuated only by bureaucratic formalities and polite expressions of regret. The initial investigation, handled by the ship's security, was perfunctory, constrained by the narrow, self-interested focus of a corporation desperate to contain a public relations nightmare. They searched their cabin, finding no signs of struggle, only the unsettling neatness of a room prepared for a restful night that never came. Jennifer's elegant evening dress lay draped over a chair, her wedding ring on the bedside table. Small, silent pieces of evidence that screamed of an interruption, a sudden, inexplicable rush from the room. The initial assumption, the one the cruise line was quick to suggest and the authorities were initially forced to entertain, was grim but familiar. An accidental fall overboard, perhaps fueled by too much celebration. An unfortunate tragedy swallowed by the churning wake of the massive ship. The vastness of the ocean served as a convenient, terrifying explanation. They had simply been lost to the waves, destined to become a footnote in the endless history of maritime misfortune. But this simple explanation, this narrative of accidental loss, did not sit right with the family. It did not account for the chilling details that were now beginning to surface, whispered from the lips of passengers and crew who were slowly beginning to shed their initial reticence. There were rumors of a volatile argument, a fierce exchange witnessed late on the last night. There was the unsettling fact of George Smith's passport and wallet being found neatly tucked away in the cabin safe. A man not prone to carelessness suddenly abandoning the most critical elements of his identity. Then came the first true crack in the official story, a horrifying discovery that shifted the emotional weight of the case from one of simple tragedy to one of potential violence. 3 years later, in a quiet, isolated stretch of the Aegean Sea, a professional salvage diver working on a sunken freighter happened upon an anomaly. It was not another piece of wreckage, nor was it a piece of ancient history. It was a suitcase. The diver, accustomed to the eerie silence of the deep, brought the case to the surface. What he found inside would change everything. The luggage, waterlogged and swollen, contained not clothes or valuables, but a specific collection of personal items: photographs of George and Jennifer, a small, distinctive locket Jennifer always wore, and a set of keys to their New York apartment. It was a carefully curated collection of memories, a macabre time capsule, intentionally sealed and discarded. Why would a couple who had simply fallen overboard take the time to pack a suitcase full of personal mementos and then throw it into the sea? The logical disconnect was staggering, shattering the accidental drowning theory with the brutal force of a depth charge. This discovery suggested a deliberate act, a chilling forethought that pointed not to a tragic accident, but to a calculated plot. A cold, dark truth, hiding beneath the gentle lapping of the Mediterranean waves. The case of George and Jennifer Smith was about to be officially resurrected, moving from the missing persons files to the homicide department, a journey that would drag their devastated families through years of hope, despair, and an unending quest for justice. The unsettling questions lingered like the scent of salt and decay. Who else was on that ship? What did they know? And what terrifying secret did that single waterlogged suitcase finally reveal? The silence of the wilderness, that vast, unblinking ocean, suddenly felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a carefully constructed wall of conspiracy. The vastness of the sea, once a symbol of freedom, now became an enormous, claustrophobic crime scene. The family's initial anxiety transformed into dread, and then solidified into a terrible, cold certainty. Something unspeakable had happened on that ship. The cruise line's polite dismissal of the case was now exposed for the calculated evasion that it truly was. The emotional toll on the families was immeasurable, a constant gnawing pain that only the full truth could ever hope to alleviate. They desperately clung to the hope that the suitcase was not a final goodbye, but a deliberate breadcrumb left by a victim or perhaps a frightened witness, a silent plea for someone to look closer, to see past the corporation's lies. The true investigation was only just beginning, a race against time and the forces of corporate obfuscation. The discovery of the sentimental suitcase 3 years after the disappearance provided the necessary emotional and forensic impetus to force the authorities to look past the surface narrative. The initial assumption of a drunken stumble and an accidental plunge was now rendered absurd. Detectives in New York, coordinating with international law enforcement, began the agonizing process of reconstructing the couple's final 24 hours, a task made exponentially harder by the intervening years. The physical evidence, the cabin, the decks, the potential crime scene was long gone, scrubbed clean by housekeeping and sailed across countless miles of ocean. All they had left were the memories of witnesses, now faded and colored by time, and the ship's own meticulous, yet often misleading records. The focus narrowed immediately onto the last port of call and the final evening's activities. Testimony, initially reluctant and vague, began to solidify around a group of 3 young male passengers who had been seen interacting with George and Jennifer late into the night. They were affluent, traveling without obvious supervision, and had reportedly been drinking heavily. The narrative began to shift from one of tragic mishap to one of a dangerous, perhaps predatory encounter. Investigators learned that the group had invited the Smiths to their private suite for a final nightcap. The last verified sighting placed George and Jennifer entering that suite around 2 a.m. This was the open loop that investigators had been desperately seeking, a clear point of no return. What happened in that cabin in the early hours of the morning? The investigators, working under the burden of the overwhelming emotional tone of the case, had to now rely on the fragile recollections of people who were likely intoxicated and certainly eager to protect themselves. The ship's surveillance footage from the night in question proved to be a dead end. Crucially, the cameras covering the hallway leading to the suite were inexplicably malfunctioning, or recorded only grainy, useless images. This incredible, convenient lapse in security raised the first serious alarms of a potential cover-up. Was it mere coincidence? Or had someone, knowing the camera's blind spots, taken advantage of them? The families represented by relentless legal counsel began to exert immense public pressure, ensuring the story did not fade from the headlines. They held up archival photos of George and Jennifer, smiling in their youthful joy, contrasting their vibrant lives with the cold, empty silence of the sea. This repetition of the theme of youthful joy versus impending dread fueled the public's engagement and kept the investigative fire lit. The emotional state of the investigators themselves was one of profound frustration. They were dealing with a ship that operated under the flag of convenience, complicating jurisdiction and allowing the cruise line to stonewall requests for internal documentation. They were forced to chase rumors of a volatile, possibly physical confrontation witnessed by a crew member who was now impossible to locate. The locket found in the sunken suitcase became a powerful, silent witness. Forensic analysis showed subtle signs of saltwater corrosion consistent with prolonged submersion. But a deeper inspection revealed something more unsettling. A faint, almost invisible, scratch pattern on the gold surface that suggested it had been ripped rather than gently removed. The story of a peaceful departure was now completely shattered. This was the physical evidence of a struggle, a final moment of resistance. The focus turned entirely to the three young men. Their names were withheld from the public at this early stage, but they became the terrifying unseen characters driving the narrative. They had disembarked at the next port and returned to their lives, seemingly unburdened by the terrible events of the Sea Voyager. The detectives faced the insurmountable obstacle of proving a crime that had occurred outside of territorial waters, on a foreign-flagged vessel years in the past, with the primary evidence, the bodies, still missing. This was the ultimate contrast. The vastness of the wilderness, the ocean, protecting the terrible claustrophobia of a burial site, the truth of the final moments. The search for the truth became a search for a needle in a watery haystack, a chilling testament to how easily justice could be circumvented by a wealthy few and a complicit corporate entity. The new line of inquiry demanded a forensic re-examination of everything, starting with the timeline, minute by agonizing minute. The new investigation, operating with the cold certainty of potential homicide, now zeroed in on the three young men, identified in the internal cruise ship logs only by their cabin number and their conspicuous spending habits. Their names, John, Michael, and David, were now circulated among international police agencies, transforming them from privileged vacationers into prime suspects in a capital crime. The narrative structure demanded a deeper understanding of their motivations, their whereabouts, and their interaction with the Smiths. Detectives established that the group had a history of reckless behavior, But mere irresponsibility was a universe away from murder. The break came not from a confession, but from a forgotten, routine piece of evidence: the ship's internal billing record. It showed an unusual high-volume laundry request placed by the men's cabin just hours after the Smiths were last seen, a request for the immediate cleaning of several pieces of heavy bedding. Why would young men celebrating on a cruise suddenly need a massive emergency laundry service at 6 a.m.? This was a procedural anomaly, a small detail that felt heavy with implication, suggesting the urgent need to clean up a large, catastrophic mess. This detail, seemingly mundane, acted as the necessary plot driver, accelerating the pacing from the slow, deliberate context building to a moment of intense, quiet action. The investigators theorized that the bedding had been soiled, perhaps by blood, and the subsequent high-pressure washing was an attempt to destroy forensic evidence. The evidence itself was, of course, long gone, but the request was an undeniable circumstantial admission of guilt, a silent scream of panic from the early morning hours. The point of view of the investigation now became intensely focused on the suspects' activities immediately following the disappearance. They had disembarked in Turkey, calm and collected, their tickets pre-booked for the flight back to the United States. They had offered no information, expressed no concern, and maintained a complete, unnerving silence. This omission of worry was as damning as any outright lie. Investigators learned that upon their return they had retained high-powered legal counsel, a move that spoke volumes about their anticipation of trouble. The legal teams immediately erected a firewall of legal privilege, making direct conversation with the suspects impossible. The narrative had to proceed through summary of conversations and legal reportage, maintaining the third-person omniscient perspective. The case now became a high-stakes game of legal maneuver and international jurisdiction. The families, driven by an emotional tone of righteous injustice, launched a civil suit against the young men and the cruise line simultaneously, leveraging the power of subpoena to bypass the criminal investigation's jurisdictional roadblocks. This civil discovery process forced the young men to give depositions, providing the first glimpse into their carefully constructed narrative of the night. Their accounts were suspiciously uniform, a coherence that betrayed rehearsal. They claimed the Smiths left their cabin around 3:30 a.m. after a pleasant, uneventful conversation, and they claimed they never saw them again. However, this perfectly clean timeline was contradicted by a single frightened voice. An elderly woman, a quiet passenger who'd occupied the cabin directly across the hallway, had initially told the ship's security she heard nothing, a statement she had quickly come to regret. Driven by guilt, she approached the family's lawyer years later. She did not hear screams, but she did hear a sound that terrified her. A sickening heavy thud, followed by the distinct, hurried sound of something being dragged down the metallic hallway. A scraping sound that was quickly muffled by the closing of a door. The dragging was followed by a prolonged, unsettling silence before the sound of a distant, closing door on the deck above. This crucial testimony provided the terrifying link. The altercation in the cabin, the heavy thud, the hurried disposal, and the final silence. The rhetorical questions for the audience became sharp and accusatory. What did the thud represent? And what heavy object was dragged down that corridor in the dead of night? The investigation now revolved around the terrifying hypothesis of a deliberate, coordinated effort to dispose of the bodies and cover the traces. The cruise line continued its formal yet accessible defense, claiming they fully cooperated, a statement that rang hollow against the backdrop of the malfunctioning cameras and the missing crew member. The contrast of the formal yet accessible language of the corporation against the tense, dramatic, and somber reality of the events underscored the emotional chasm between the search for profit and the search for truth. The evidence, though circumstantial, was piling up. The laundry order, the scratched locket, and the chilling testimony of the witness. The truth, like the sunken suitcase, was beginning to surface, revealing a plot far darker than anyone had initially imagined. The testimony of the elderly passenger, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, became the fulcrum upon which the entire case pivoted. Her simple recollection of a sickening heavy thud and the sound of something being dragged transformed the suspect's synchronized, clean narrative from a defense into a lie. The sound of dragging, she recalled, had been metallic and muffled, leading investigators to focus on the seldom used service-level stairwells and maintenance corridors of the Sea Voyager, areas outside the passenger traffic flow. This detailed sensory recall created the necessary vivid imagery for the narrative. The detectives now turned their attention back to the ocean, but with a new, highly specific search grid based on the ship's last known trajectory and the likely location of an intentional disposal. The deep ocean, once a mere obstacle, now had to be systematically analyzed. The concept of contrasts was central to this phase. The immense size of the ship designed for joyous escape, now the confined space of a deliberate act of violence. The vast, indifferent ocean, now the critical forensic environment. The narrative's deliberate pacing slowed once more, focusing on the highly technical dry process of forensic analysis. The ship's deck plans were pored over, leading investigators to a single narrow service hatch on the ship's lowest passenger deck, near the men's suite, a hatch typically used for crew access to storage. The possibility was terrifyingly simple. A quick, desperate attempt to dispose of evidence, or worse, victims, into the sea. The omniscient perspective allowed the storyteller to convey the investigators' thought processes. They knew the suspects had time constraints. The ship was due to dock in a matter of hours. The disposal had to be immediate and final. The legal battle in the civil court intensified, becoming the main venue for the evidence presentation. The Erdstein attorneys representing the Smith family relentlessly hammered on the repetition of key themes: the silence of the crew, the cover-up by the cruise line, and the inexplicable nature of the disappearance. They forced the production of internal communications, revealing a series of panicked yet coded messages between the ship's security and the corporate office in the hours following the discovery that the Smiths were missing. These communications, while not explicit confessions, betrayed a singular focus on risk management and media control, rather than genuine concern for the safety of the passengers. The language style of these internal documents, formal, precise, and devoid of human warmth, stood in sharp contrast to the human tragedy they sought to minimize. During a highly contentious deposition, one of the three suspects, Michael, momentarily broke his carefully constructed veneer of calm. Under intense questioning about the laundry request, he paused, his eyes darting away from the camera. The attorney pressed him on the specific items listed: 2 heavy king-size duvets. Michael's lawyer immediately objected. But the damage was done. His body language, the slight tremor in his voice, suggested a fissure in the united front. This minor character action was crucial in maintaining the plot-driven narrative while enhancing the drama. The investigators took this as a sign of anxiety and dread, a confirmation of their suspicion that the cleaning request was a crucial element of the cleanup operation. It became clear to the audience, through the narrator's detached reporting, that one of the young men was closer to breaking than the others. The emotional arc of the narrative now moved toward a horrific certainty. The search for the missing pieces of evidence, the bodies, became an exercise in advanced marine technology. Using high-resolution sonar and remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, a targeted search was conducted along the vessel's route. The sheer depth of the Mediterranean presented a nearly insurmountable challenge, but the family's perseverance, a quiet, emotional weight that permeated the entire case, refused to allow the search to be abandoned. The discovery, when it finally came, was not the full, agonizing closure they sought, but a final, heartbreaking piece of physical evidence that definitively closed the door on the accidental drowning theory and opened another onto a much darker room. Far below the surface, entangled in a deep-sea fishing net, the ROV captured images of a heavily degraded piece of fabric. Upon retrieval, forensic experts confirmed it was a fragment of a ship's towel, likely from the laundry service, but that wasn't the critical piece. Wrapped within the towel, protected from the worst of the elements, was a small rusted metal pendant, recognizable instantly by George's family. A small personalized gift Jennifer had given him on their wedding day. This detailed physical description of evidence served as the definitive plot driver, a final, undeniable confirmation that George Smith did not simply fall overboard. His personal effects, along with his wife's, were intentionally disposed of, hours after they were last seen alive, confirming the most terrible suspicion of all. They were murdered, and their bodies cast into the crushing depth of the sea. The narrative's pacing accelerated once more. The initial mystery now solidified into a shocking, profound injustice that demanded final accountability. The retrieval of the rusted pendant from the depths provided the final, tragic piece of material evidence, transforming the case from one of suspicion to one of near certainty in the court of public opinion. The open loop had been closed, but the ultimate prize, the full truth of what transpired and the location of the bodies, remained tantalizingly out of reach. The focus shifted entirely to the suspect's movements after the thud and drag were heard. Investigators theorized that the bodies, weighed down by heavy bedding and potentially other items, had been tossed overboard, sinking rapidly into the abyssal plain. The sheer depth and the constant currents meant a recovery operation was practically impossible, a cruel final victory for the perpetrators in the vast, indifferent ocean. The contrast of the small sentimental pendant, a token of love and hope, against the immensity of the deep-sea search created a dramatic, almost unbearable sense of gravity. The investigators now attempted to reconstruct the actual sequence of the crime, using the physical clues as their guide. The locket was torn, suggesting a physical struggle in the cabin. The heavy laundry order suggested a massive cleanup. The final disposal, confirmed by the pendant, indicated a rush to remove all traces before the ship reached port. The third-person omniscient narrator now provided the terrifying probable scenario: an altercation, perhaps fueled by alcohol and a sense of entitlement, that escalated into fatal violence. The suspects then panicked, utilizing their cabin's proximity to the service hatch to dispose of the bodies under the cover of the early morning hours, hours where the ship was mostly silent and most passengers were asleep. The young men, protected by their powerful family connections and the labyrinthine nature of international law, remained legally untouchable in the criminal sphere. The U.S. authorities had jurisdiction over American citizens, but proving a murder took place on a foreign-flagged vessel required the kind of concrete evidence, a body, a confession, that the suspects and the sea refused to yield. This impasse became the central element of the final act, an unbearable injustice that amplified the emotional tone of dread and tragedy. The family, refusing to accept this legal stalemate, pursued the civil case with an almost fanatical determination. The power of civil discovery proved to be the Achilles heel of the defense. During a subsequent deposition, the lead suspect, John, was confronted with the composite of evidence: the laundry request, the woman's testimony, the timeline discrepancies, and the two recovered artifacts, the suitcase and the pendant. The attorney used the sentence style of short, declarative statements for emphasis. You needed to clean the blood. You threw their things overboard. You murdered George and Jennifer Smith. The suspect's answer, a muffled, almost inaudible, "I plead the fifth," was not a legal admission of guilt, but it was, for the court of public opinion, the final undeniable confession. The deposition was summarized as narrative reportage, maintaining the desired dialogue limitation, yet conveying the immense emotional weight of the confrontation. The civil case concluded not with a criminal conviction, but with a massive financial settlement from both the suspects and the cruise line. The settlement, while providing a degree of financial justice, was a tacit admission of responsibility, a final public acknowledgement of the cover-up and the underlying violent acts. The settlement was a cold, hard number, but for the family, the true value was the accompanying statement from the cruise line, finally acknowledging the probability of a crime and expressing a profound, though years too late, regret. This was the dark resolution to the mystery, the final contrast between the money-driven settlement and the immeasurable value of the lives lost. The pacing finally slowed to a reflective, somber note, focusing on the aftermath. The suspects, though financially punished, never faced jail time for the presumed double murder. They returned to their privileged lives, forever marked by the case, but legally free. The cruise line implemented new, stringent security measures and altered its reporting protocols, changes born from the public outcry generated by this single devastating case. The story of George and Jennifer Smith became a rallying cry for maritime safety reform, a powerful, tragic narrative of a system designed to protect itself above all else. The families, their anxiety and dread replaced by a quiet, enduring grief, knew the full truth, even if the law never fully confirmed it. The vast blue expanse of the Mediterranean held the final physical evidence, a permanent, silent tomb for the two young people who had embarked on their dream cruise but instead became victims of a terrible, unspeakable crime. A dark secret, finally dragged into the light by a simple, waterlogged suitcase and a rusted pendant. The story of George and Jennifer Smith remains etched in the collective memory, not simply as a true crime narrative, but as a chilling indictment of corporate indifference and the terrifying ease with which justice can be circumvented when wealth and international jurisdiction conspire. The final horrifying truth, pieced together from fragments of evidence, frightened whispers, and financial settlements, was one of murder and subsequent disposal, a scenario far removed from the cruise line's initial convenient narrative of accidental tragedy. The emotional arc concluded not with catharsis, but with a profound, lingering sense of injustice. The three young men, the unnamed characters who drove the narrative's darkest moments, disappeared back into the protective shadows of their wealth. Though a civil court found them responsible, the ultimate justice, the criminal conviction the families desperately sought, remained unserved. The final act of the story is the legacy of the victims, a legacy that became a catalyst for change. Their case forced the implementation of stricter reporting requirements for crimes committed aboard cruise ships, ensuring that future disappearances could not be as easily dismissed as a simple unfortunate accident. The repetition of key themes, the silence of the wilderness, the emotional toll on the families, served to emphasize the long-term impact of the crime. The cruise ship Sea Voyager itself, a symbol of the initial youthful joy and the eventual impending dread, continued to sail the seas, its decks carrying new passengers unaware of the terrible secret the vessel had carried. The physical evidence, the suitcase, and the pendant were returned to the families, small, heavy reminders of the lives that were abruptly and brutally cut short. They were no longer mere pieces of evidence, but sacred artifacts of a lost life and a hard-won, partial victory against the forces of denial and obfuscation. The point of view remains detached, omniscient, recounting the facts with the necessary gravity and emotional weight. The narrator not mourning but reporting on the tragedy that demanded to be told. The final summation of the case is a chilling realization. The claustrophobia of a burial site was, in fact, the endless, boundless abyss of the deep ocean, the perfect hiding place provided by a deliberate, coordinated act of violence. This vastness, however, could not conceal the truth entirely. It was the small human details, a scratch on a locket, an urgent laundry request, the sound of a drag, that finally pierced the veil of secrecy. The families years later continue their advocacy, turning their private grief into a public call for accountability. The script ends not on a moment of final resolution, but on the quiet, enduring pain of the unknown. They achieved legal and financial closure, but they could never truly close the book on the final moments of George and Jennifer Smith. Those final horrific seconds, the terror and the struggle, remain sealed in the depths, known only to the perpetrators and the cold, unyielding silence of the sea. The question is no longer what happened, but why the system allowed it to remain unpunished for so long. The case of the New York couple became a powerful, somber warning to all who step aboard a vessel and trust its promise of safe passage. Out on the open sea, you are often truly alone, and the only witness to a crime may be the deep, dark ocean itself.